a fictional story. All names, people, and events below are invented for narrative purposes and do not depict any real person. For more than 4 decades, Walter Kane was the calm voice that families trusted inside their own homes. He explained problems patiently, fixed what others overlooked, and never raised his voice, even when the work was hard. But behind that steady presence, questions followed him for years. Now, at 77, Walter Kane has finally decided to speak. Not to teach, not to demonstrate, but to clarify a truth he had quietly carried while the world kept guessing. For most viewers, Walter Kane was never really a television personality. He was something rarer than that, a constant. While co-hosts changed, formats evolved, and trends came and went around him, Walter remained the same measured presence, guiding homeowners through complicated repairs without ever needing drama to hold their attention. Since joining the long-running home renovation program Foundations in the mid-1980s, he became synonymous with trust. When Walter spoke, people listened. When he warned against a shortcut, homeowners believed him, because that trust was never built on charisma or performance. It was built on repetition, on consistency, on decades of showing up the same way, year after year, storm after storm, house after house. But familiarity has a strange side effect. The longer someone stays visible, the more people assume they understand everything about them. Viewers watched Walter solve structural failures, rebuild homes that looked beyond saving, and quietly step aside so a younger builder could take the lead and learn. What they did not see were the private pressures that accumulated off-camera, out of frame, in the quiet hours after the crew packed up and went home. Over time, longtime fans began to notice small changes. Walter appeared slightly less often in a season. Younger builders took on more screen time. Online forums started asking the same question, over and over. Was something wrong, or was something ending? The speculation grew louder after he passed 70. Headlines hinted at retirement. Comment sections filled with concern. Some viewers assumed age had finally forced him to slow down. Others believed producers were quietly pushing him toward the exit to make room for someone younger. None of it came from Walter himself. He never announced a departure. He never teased a farewell season. And that silence only fed the rumors further. What most viewers never realized is that Walter Kane had never been interested in controlling a public narrative. He didn't explain his absences. He didn't correct assumptions floating around the internet. He believed, simply, that the work should speak for itself. But silence, especially from someone the public feels they know, often invites its own interpretation. And as the questions piled up year after year, the gap between what people believed and what was actually happening quietly widened. At 77, Walter reached a point where staying silent no longer felt like the responsible thing to do. Not because he owed anyone an explanation for how he chose to live his life, but because the truth had grown more complicated than the rumors swirling around him. What he was facing wasn't a single decision. It was the accumulated weight of decades, physical strain absorbed one job site at a time, an emotional loss he had never spoken about publicly, private choices made quietly and without fanfare, and one truth he had deliberately kept out of the spotlight for over 20 years. The rumors, it turned out, were wrong in almost every detail, but they were circling something real. And for the first time in his long career, Walter Kane was ready to say what had actually been happening behind that calm, steady exterior. As Foundations grew from a modest public television experiment into something closer to a national institution, the pressure surrounding it changed in ways viewers never saw. What began as an educational series grounded in patience and realism slowly had to adapt to tighter shooting schedules, broader audiences, and the evolving demands of modern broadcast television. For Walter, those changes created a tension that followed him for decades, a tension between doing the work correctly and doing it fast enough to fit inside a broadcast hour. From the late 1980s into the early 1990s, Walter found himself increasingly at odds with what producers wanted from him. These are not petty disagreements over camera angles or which line of narration sounded better. They were disagreements about integrity. Walter believed construction could not be rushed without real consequences. Drying times mattered. Structural logic mattered. Showing the mistakes, not just the finished product, matter because that was how people actually learned. But television schedules did not always allow for that kind of honesty. When producers suggested compressing build timelines or simplifying explanations just to keep an episode moving along, Walter pushed back. Not loudly, not in front of cameras, but firmly in the rooms where those decisions got made. At more than one point, those disagreements came close to ending his time on the show altogether. Crew members who worked alongside him for years later described moments when Walter privately considered walking away, not out of anger, but out of principle. He had spent his entire working life earning trust out in the field, one job at a time, and he was not willing to trade that trust for the sake of convenience. To him, misleading viewers, even in a small and subtle way, felt worse than simply leaving the show behind. The most serious of those moments came later, when the accumulated stress finally reached a breaking point. In the early 2000s, Walter sat down and drafted a resignation letter. It wasn't an impulsive decision. He talked it through with his family first. He weighed what stepping away would mean, both for the show and for the audience that had come to depend on it for honest guidance. In the end, it was the producers who shifted their position, not Walter. They had come to understand that he was not simply another contractor filling a role in front of camera. He was the moral center of the entire program. His insistence on accuracy was the reason viewers trusted what they were watching in the first place. The compromise that followed reshaped the show's internal dynamics for years afterward. Walter was given far greater authority over how the construction work itself would be portrayed on screen. His voice carried more weight on every job site the crew visited. Technical accuracy was no longer something to be negotiated for the sake of pacing. That decision helped preserve the trust of millions of viewers, but it also came with a personal cost that few people ever recognized. Walter had quietly taken on the responsibility of being the one line that would not bend, no matter how much pressure was applied around him. As television itself kept evolving into the 2000s and beyond, new pressures emerged. Streaming platforms, faster pacing, and younger audiences pushed producers to explore fresher formats and newer faces. Once again, Walter felt a familiar tension settle over him. This time it was quieter, but no less heavy. Reducing his screen time was framed by the network as a kind of natural evolution, a passing of the torch. But Walter saw a different risk in it, the risk of losing depth in exchange for speed. He never resisted change for its own sake. What he resisted was losing meaning. In 2016, something happened that quietly altered Walter Kane in a way no scheduling conflict or production disagreement ever had. A young crew member named Marcus Reyes, who had been working on Foundations for several seasons, passed away suddenly during an active filming stretch. To the public watching at home, it was little more than a brief mention, a name in the closing credits that disappeared far too quickly. To Walter, it was devastating. Marcus had not just been another name on the crew list. He was someone Walter had personally taken under his wing, someone he corrected on site, encouraged when the work got discouraging, and trusted with responsibilities most young crew members never got near. Walter had always believed that teaching mattered as much as building, and in Marcus he saw the kind of future he hoped the trade itself could still have: curious, disciplined, genuinely eager to learn the work the right way, not just the fast way. Losing him wasn't simply a professional loss for Walter. It was deeply personal in a way that didn't have a clean edge to it. People close to the production noticed the shift in him almost immediately. Walter became quieter. He withdrew from the casual conversations that used to fill the downtime between takes. Meetings that once ran on his steady, confident input now passed with far fewer words from him. For the first time in decades of doing this work, he found himself genuinely questioning whether continuing made sense at all. Not because he'd lost his passion for building, but because grief had introduced a kind of weight he simply couldn't fix with tools or experience. Walter had spent his entire career solving problems. Structural failures could be reinforced. Rotten beams could be pulled out and replaced. Even homes that looked beyond saving could be restored with enough patience and the right materials. But this was different. There was no repair for it. No technique, no material, nothing that could undo what had happened. That realization shook him more deeply than he ever let on publicly, even to people who worked beside him every day. For months after Marcus's death, Walter seriously considered stepping away from the show for good. People who worked closely with him later said it was the closest he ever came to walking away entirely. The work reminded him of the loss. Teaching reminded him of exactly who was missing from the crew now. And the idea of simply continuing on as if nothing had changed felt, to him, unbearable. What ultimately changed his direction came from a place he hadn't expected. Marcus's family reached out to Walter directly. Instead of anger, instead of blame, what they offered him was gratitude. They told him how much Marcus had admired him, how often he'd talked at home about what he was learning from Walter, and how genuinely proud he had been to work alongside someone he respected that much. Those conversations didn't erase the grief Walter was carrying, but they reframed it. Slowly, he began to understand that walking away wouldn't honor what had been lost. Staying, teaching, continuing the work, that might. He returned to the show gradually, not with the same emotional distance he'd carried before, but with a renewed and quieter sense of purpose. The grief never fully left him. It simply settled into him, becoming part of how he moved through the rest of his career. For decades, Walter Kane lived two parallel lives, and almost no one around him noticed. One life unfolded in front of millions of television viewers. Measured explanations, careful edits, a calm authority that made even the most difficult repairs feel manageable. The other existed almost entirely off camera, protected deliberately by his own silence. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a controversy. It was something far quieter and, in its own way, far heavier. In the late 1990s, long before social media existed and long before public figures were expected to turn every act of generosity into a headline, Walter made a decision that would quietly shape the rest of his life. He began funding disaster recovery efforts for families who had lost nearly everything, not through televised fundraising campaigns, not through public donation drives, but through direct, unannounced action. Rebuilding homes, replacing what fire and storms had taken, and then stepping away without ever attaching his name to any of it. The work started small. A family